early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
And now to our second big story for today, which is to look at climate change financing. In the year 2009, Committee of Nations, precisely the developed nations, about 24 countries, made a commitment to devote a sum of $100 billion annually to helping developing nations meeting their targets as regards climate change financing. But the question is, what has been the level of this commitment and the level of success given the year 2024? Record has shown that by the year 2020, the target was met, even though it's some years after, we're still talking about the need to increase the funding for meeting the climate change actions. And statistics have shown that to be able to meet the target for the year 2030, nations needs to raise trillions of dollars to be able to meet this target, which is also going to be the thrust of conversation for COP29, the conference slated for November this year. That will be the thrust of our conversation now. And joining us in shaping policy in this regard, we have Brian Owino, who joins us all the way from Kenya. Brian, glad to have you join us on the next thing this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Femi. It's always a pleasure to have these discussions in shaping the future of Africa and the global climate actions. Thank you.
Yes, it's One Africa. So good to see you. How is Kenya today?
Yeah, the weather is a bit cloudy and rainy, and we are experiencing a bit of climate change impact as well. These variabilities, we keep seeing them happening from time to time, and it's not going to end today. And that's why we need very strong actions coming from COP29 from 11th to 22nd November this year.
All right, great. Now let's set the ball rolling. You're aware of the Paris Agreement for the year 2015 and also the commitment made by developed nations, what you call OECD nations, in the year 2009, to make a commitment of $100 billion to developing nations in helping them to meet their targets. I would like to start by having your assessment of the level of commitment to this funding. Aren't you worried that even in the year 2024, we're still talking about the targets as regards the funding and the level of dedication that should have been devoted by the Committee of Nations towards hitting the target by the year 2030? Let's start with your assessment and some of your concerns.
Well, thank you, Femi. This commitment was set in the year 2009, and the aim was to support developing countries, especially Africa and small island and developing states, who more or less contribute to less emissions within the global emission framework. And the aim of this financing was to support both mitigation and adaptation actions in these countries, more specifically on the adaptation end, where the impacts are really crippling both the economy and the people from these regions. By 2022, this was achieved, yes, but this was achieved 2 years later. 2020 was the target. This was achieved in 2022. But if you look at the form of financing, how this financing is coming to these countries, most of it, about 69%, is flowing as in form of loans. And we understand that these countries are already grappling with the debt burden, which is even making this difficult. So the form in which this finance should flow, and within the Paris Agreement framework, there was a lot of debate around the role of private sector, for example, private sector capital that is flowing as well, whether this money should come in as either ODA or that is the direct assistance, or it would come as in the form of foreign direct investments, is really one question that needs as well to be clarified, especially in the scope of climate negotiations. So in as much as we head towards COP29, where there's already a push to revise this figure to set new targets in terms of how much to commit to developing countries, it's something that we are looking forward to see. And I believe probably that the African nations or the African negotiators will have the right, place in this discussion or in these negotiations in COP29.
Okay, now let's talk about, gathering the right funding needed to make some of these actions. What are some of the challenges here, the setback you think some of these countries are experiencing? Now, if there's a resolve to have a pool of funds to achieve this target, why do you think some countries have not been able to fulfill their obligation? And now you're coming up with, there's a new reality now that the $100 billion target might not even be enough to meet what is expected. And that's why COP29 is reviewing the targets and the goals for the climate financing and the energy sector. What are the concerns here? Why do we have this kind of disparity? And another side to it is there are those who argue that why do you want to burden developed nations more as regards the funding? Isn't that a way to excuse developing nations from making some commitment? Though there are those who argue that, okay, they are the largest polluters, and so they should take up the financial muscle. What's your take on these two narratives?
Well, the major challenge I see is that right from the onset in Paris Agreement, the rules were not clear because there was a basis of the nationally determined contributions. And the basis is that these targets are voluntary, which means based on sovereignty and based on the national priorities, for example, that supersedes, what is happening within this framework. So when we have some of the articles in the Paris Agreement, especially for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the carbon markets and how climate finance should flow, especially making it very clear that if it's 100 billion, this should be transferred in these forms. And we saw that much of this is even included in terms of how the private capital can be organized and support the developing countries. So this lack of clarity in the forms in which this finance should flow is one area that needed a lot of clarity and needed a lot of negotiations so that it's clear from the rule book, the Paris rule book, that a developing nation needs to receive X amount from these developed countries. I know there are a lot of frameworks that have been adopted. For example, the clean adjustment mechanisms, technology transfer, how much that, whenever two entities one from developed countries and developing country are in partnership, do we account for this as, climate finance? Does it account for, taking part of that 100 billion that is promised? So this clarity, these are the things that needs to be clarified, even as we move forth and begin to think about setting new targets beyond what is already there for the 2022, for the 2020, I mean. Setting these new targets needs to be very clear, whether it's going to flow in the form of private sector, public, finance, whether it's going to pass through the international climate funds. Then there is need to be clarity on the forms, whether this will be in the form of debts, loans, or direct payments, which majority of this has been flowing as loans. And this is where I see a huge challenge, especially to developing nations, that still the issue of debt is something that these countries are suffering from.
Now let's talk about COP29. The summit is expected to start in November. And now that you have a new goal set for the financial template, what are your expectations? What will be the impact of the summit on meeting the target and also setting the clarity needed as regards this financing and also the activities that should complement the finance? Because most of the time, we're even talking about the money. We're not talking about the activities. They are not well spelled out. Even though individual nations are using their initiative as regards to what should drive that. But let's talk about the expectations from this conference. Now there's a resolve to set a new target as regards the funding and activities in respect to the actions related to climate change.
Thank you for that, Femi. COP29 based on the presidency and the set outline, there are four key areas that we are going to see, you know, a lot of discussions and negotiations are happening around that. But already, just before get that, there's already a precedent that was set by the African nations, especially during the Africa Climate Summit last year in September that happened in Nairobi. And similarly, just yesterday, there was already a discussion with the parliamentarians who lead the climate negotiations, that is the African negotiators, trying to set pace so that there's a communication and there's negotiations that is happening in unison rather than, based on the sovereign priorities or based on the sovereign friendships. That is really something that is going to set precedence on how developing countries will, get towards these negotiations. But looking at the key set of activities, one area that is receiving a lot of attention is the energy storage, that is the renewable energy as well. There's an intention to increase renewable energy by sixfold, and this is really good for the climate targets because clean energy transition is very vital, especially in limiting the warming to 1.5 scenario by 2030. That is extremely ambitious and it needs a lot of action, not just from developed countries, but also from developing economies. And that is why this funding, which also forms part of this discussion, needs to flow more quickly to the countries that they need it. For example, I give an example of Africa where we need about 70 billion annually in order to achieve clean energy transition by 2030. This, we need to see it coming out very clearly in the COP29. Secondly, we also expect to see much dialogue happening around, the role of the fossil fuel producing countries. And there's an intention already to, set up a fund where they can voluntarily chip in and pull some resources to support the countries that are already experiencing the adverse impacts of climate change to adapt and to, build resilience in ways that they can ensure that the people who are most impacted are able to, get better, cope through, and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And then lastly, aside on that, there is a huge discussion on hydrogen, the potential of hydrogen, especially on the hard-to-abate sectors, which includes the aspects of industrialization and the aspects of the manufacturing sector, that is the cement, steel, those are very hard-to-abate sectors. And what also hydrogen could play in when it comes to transport sectors. This is still very ambitious for Africa, but we believe that the potential that is seen, especially in the northern part of Africa, as well as in Namibia and some parts of East Africa, could really present a lucrative opportunity to advance the goals of the continent when it comes to these negotiations.
All right, still on COP29, the influence on meeting the target. You're aware that when you have this kind of summit, there's always that enthusiasm to make promises. You have nations coming on board to make pledges and commitment, just like what played out in 2009. You have that of 2015 as regards the Paris Agreement. And some even perceive that some of these pledges look political, because thereafter, the level of commitment expected to releasing these funds, they are not usually there. What do you think can be done differently at this summit to ensure that the level of commitment, most importantly for the African continent, is improved on, is better than what we used to have? I don't know what magic that could be brought into the equation this time around, but I hope you can tell me what can be done differently to improve the level of commitment, especially when it comes to African nations.
Thank you, Femi. One thing that really started last year in 2023 that could be advanced further is the global stock taking process. And global stock taking process is where, after the 5 year of implementing Paris Agreement, then we need to go back and look at what milestones have we achieved, whether we're on track or not. And that is why we see that there is the need to revise ambitions. Revising ambitions means we go back to the nationally determined contributions and look at our adaptation goals and look at them and understand, look at them in a way that are their financial needs tied to them, are their financial figures tied to them. And this was one of that we had in the first set of 5 years with our adaptation goals, for instance, within the Africa scope. You find that countries submit NDCs, especially adaptation goals, which do not have a good level of clarity, especially when it comes to the equivalent or the needed financial requirements to drive them further. This has been revised in some countries. There's some sort of clarity. And also, when it comes to the Africa Climate Summit that happened last year, this really brought in the aspect of needs and how we can reinforce, climate action within our political space. And that's why even yesterday, these leaders met, and these are very high-level leaders, the parliamentarians who passed the laws in parliament. And this sets foot, it really gives a base of action, and we are going to see much and more awareness in terms of what policies need to be there within each countries, right from the national action plans and the NDC targets in the mitigation and the energy targets, the renewable energy targets, the electrification programs. This needs to be consolidated together in one core element, which is political goodwill. So once this political goodwill is well reinforced within, the national or the several states, then we are able to speak in one voice when it comes to negotiation. And, when there's a voting to take place, then the countries are able to take part actively and with a better understanding of what negotiations mean and what targets are needed to be achieved within the scope of between now and 2030.
All right, let's hope that this time around they will have more commitment and more funds will be devoted to this action plan. But let's make the assumption that the money is there now, the made pledges and the money is there now. Let's look at how to rechannel this money to the right activities that should drive this narrative. You're aware that a lot of activities spelled out as regards the SDG goals, goal 13, talking about climate change activities. Now, how do we ensure that the right data, the right statistics are available to drive this narrative? Let's also address the challenge of transparency. We're talking about funds here. So in your own wisdom, how do you think these funds can be rightly channeled towards the right activities? And then how do we ensure this transparency, accountability, and also having the right data to drive this fund, most importantly for our continent, where the issue of data has been challenging, and then there are issues as regards transparency. So if I'm going to bring these two as one question, the issue of data transparency, for us to be able to rightly rechannel this funding, how do we address all this?
Thank you very much for that. Again, within the scope of Paris Agreement, if you look at Article 11, for example, and Article 12 as well, in the Paris Agreement, there's a global transparency framework, which means every country needs to submit their targets and submit whatever they've achieved, and also plus their goals to the UNFCCC. And this is all taken into account and recorded. Some of this information should be made public so that it's accessible to the public, and we know that this is how much that is being spent on this. And from time to time, the targets are revised, and this is checked against the original targets. And this is what it's meant with the global stock taking process, which started in 2023. And again, when it comes to the sovereign states, each of these countries, there is need for them to further develop frameworks for to involve every stakeholder, especially when it comes to revising their nationally determined contributions. We understand the issue of data is quite a challenge, and most of this is because of lack of capacity building. How do we collect the right climate data, for instance? how do we enable their, the hierarchy, especially when it comes to the scientific data within the climate space? How does it interact with other social and socioeconomic areas? So having the right data is one area that each of these countries need to be guided. And some work has been going so well when it comes to capacity building, in enhancing the capacity of national institutions. For example, having the right uh, policy frameworks in order to advance climate data, and in order to, one key example is within the energy sector, for instance, where there's a lot of fostering to drive energy access in Africa through, the data that is available. Where do we have the last mile people, and how do we connect them? And also, what is there in the private sector? What are the misses? What are the gaps? So these are really critical questions and key data points that needs to be brought together in order to seal in the gaps. So wherever we get this level of funding, wherever state gets this level of funding, they understand where the links, where the vulnerability lie, where the exposures lie. And this drives the investment criteria. And this is really critical. Still, data is a challenge, but we are headed in the right direction when it comes to capacity building, and as well as the knowledge about climate change. This is done by all stakeholders, both the non-governmental institutions as well as the national institutions that are in charge of policy making at national level.
All right, interesting. I must confess you're doing well. Now, still on the new finance goal for climate funding. Now, you're aware that the initial plan was made by 24 countries, the initial commitment of $100 billion, 24 countries. Now, there are those who argue that 3 decades after now, there's a need to expand the scope, not just for developed nations to make more commitment, but also for developing nations. So my question is, what do you think should be the framework to determine the nations who are to contribute to the new finance goal?
Yeah, I understand this is a very critical debate, especially with China's economy growing and emitting even more, and also India's economy growing further. These are really some of the debates that we'll see. But however, there's one critical agreement that was passed, that was common but differentiated responsibility, the CBDR principle. This was very controversial, but if this is revised and it brings to scope the developing countries, I'm not sure if we need to bring more developing countries, especially in the Caribbean and African countries. This is upon the member states to come together again to review and look at it. But still, we cannot dispute the fact that historical emissions, we know them. We have data on that. We've seen what has been happening since pre-industrial periods. So whenever there's going to be a mechanism, to pull more resources, regardless of being developed or being a developing country, that is something that needs to be approached amicably, because we understand where we came from, and we understand that the historical emissions had nothing to do with developing countries, and whoever was responsible needs to take charge of this. However, leaving that aside, the need to bring the developing countries, especially when it comes to financial contributions, maybe there should be some sort of agreement on how the private sector can be involved, rather than not including these contributions within the scope of the new targets. And this is an area of debate that we even saw before the agreement early this year on whether to set this new target or not. It's still a negotiation. I would mention or say it prematurely, but let's wait and see what happens at COP29.
All right. I would like us to, I'm not trying to be selfish here, but I would like us to focus now on our continent, which is the African continent. I like the fact that you are from Kenya. You can give us a picture of what is happening as regards climate financing, which might not be different or can be a little reference to what is happening in other African countries. Let's narrow the scope to Africa now, where we look at the level of commitment and financing. We're aware of what African Development Bank is doing, talking about the multilateral banks revealing that in the year 2023, their climate action financing hit $125 billion target. Now, let's start with you giving us a picture of what is playing out in Kenya as regards commitment to climate financing. We can also look at other countries, Nigeria and the rest of them, Africa as a whole. What will be your assessment of the level of commitment to climate financing? And then the role of AFDB, how will you assess that role? And then the loopholes that need to be plugged as regards climate financing in Africa?
Yes, when it comes to the national states, our countries, there's the need to even look further on how we spend in the national budgets, especially how much is allocated to climate action. And this could be embedded within the key sectors such as agriculture. And from the context of Kenya, there's a lot going on when it comes to climate action. I'm not saying this is enough. There's much needed to be done, especially in the northern countries, in the northern counties or the northern region, where we have 80% of the landmass, which is arid and semi-arid region in the country. There's much more needed, especially financing flowing to the right people who need it the most at the right time, especially when it comes to timing. So every country, I think this can even be happening within our states, within the continent, to ensure that every country within their budget, there's a specific percentage of allocation to fight climate change, for instance, so that we can track and see impact in the lives of people building resilience, farmers, getting the right support they require, especially when it comes to getting the right climate information services. Again, linking this to the role of MFIs, the MDBs as well. For example, Africa Development Bank has an excellent program around Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which currently focuses on 26 countries. That is a good example of how this financing is flowing. But then just after COVID, we noticed a very significant reallocation of capital on how these financial institutions are spending their money. And this we are continuously going to see. And just an example of how FDB is doing this is that the current portfolio, especially on the financing portfolio, the types of projects that they fund, one of the selection criteria or one of the criteria in which they fund their projects is the green aspect. And recently, up to 215 billion that was achieved in 2023 is a huge milestone, and that is highly plausible. And we will see more of this happening because we need to take action now, and more focus needs to be given to adaptation, and which I'm really, really, really pleased that the bank is taking that direction.
Now you consider that to be an appreciable progress, looking at the target $1.5 billion. But let's look at the report itself, and I would love you to react to it. From what is spelled out here, you have $74.7 billion devoted to low and medium income economies. And then the second part is what I want you to talk about. 67% of the money, which is about $50 billion, went to finance climate mitigation, which refers to actions that reduce and avoid the issue of greenhouse emission. Now, I want you to react. If like about $50 billion, which is like 67% of the money went to climate mitigation, what kind of picture does that portray to you as regards the setback or some of the issues around climate change itself?
Well, this is the core of the issue because we need to adapt quickly. And, according to the report on adaptation gap, the cost of adaptation will even grow further as we head towards 2030 and 2050. And that means that we need to move fast enough, especially on how capital or finance flows towards the adaptation end. Looking at that figure, it's much better than what we see at global scale, to speak realistically on that, because what we see globally is that just 6% of climate finance is flowing towards adaptation. Whereas you see at FTB portfolio, for example, the MFIs, the financing is, about 43%. I think that's really good. And looking at the strategy of the bank, there's more and more push to have more money reallocated towards adaptation. And that should be the way to go, because as in Africa, the impacts of climate change are more or less felt already, and this is adaptation. We do not say that mitigation is not a priority. It should be, but we need to prioritize and see what needs to be tackled first in the right way, with the right finances, with the limited resources that we have. In as much as we accelerate mitigation, which has more mature, technologies that can be financed within the capital markets. When it comes to the other side of adaptation, there's really limited technologies or limited solutions that can be financed, and this needs some sort of initial capital flowing in the right areas in order to, stimulate and accelerate fast adaptation, so that there's quick resilience to the people within the continent.
All right, let's still talk about the issue of climate adaptation, which is it's a crucial issue here in Africa. Now, what other areas you think this money should be devoted to? Because there are critical areas as regards activities that should guide us. What are some of these activities, and how can it get better in Africa when it comes to the challenge of climate adaptation?
Thank you. Yeah. So every country has their own priorities. But when we overall look at the continent, agriculture sector, which employs the majority, contributes more than 30% of the GDP, is really critical. So when we finance or channel resources to this sector, then it means we are transforming agriculture. We are financing climate smart agriculture. We are building resilience. We are rolling out drought tolerant crops, as well as new technologies that can support farmers, especially local farmers in local communities, to build better resilience and feed the economies, as well as the continent, where even food security is still a challenge. That is one key critical sector. Then secondly, we also need to build resilience, especially within the urban centers, the infrastructure, for instance. And there's a huge push for nature-based solutions, for instance, to ensure that whenever there's flooding, uh, for example, in Lagos, there's mechanisms that can support the city to adapt better and even cope to climatic shocks such as floods and drought. Again, when it comes to the coastal cities, where we have the cyclones, especially in areas like Mozambique, there's need to foster further mechanisms or new approaches to ensure that the people living within the coastal zones are safe and they are able to be safeguarded against climate shocks. And then lastly, uh, there's loss and damage. There's the residual impacts that we cannot avoid at all. So payments and social protection, especially those in marginalized societies, this needs to be advanced so that everybody is at stake and there's an inclusive approach towards climate action. Those are the key sectors, but that's not all. Some of this priority um, may be different depending on country to country within the continent.
And let's wrap up this conversation with this interesting question, which is the target set for SDG, is the year 2030. That's the deadline. And as regards climate actions, you're aware that of some of the activities that have been taken. This is year 2024. You're aware of the commitment to zero or low carbon emission by the year 2030. We are in 2024. Are you optimistic that this target is going to be achievable, it's going to be realized, it's something that's going to be a reality by the year 2030?
Well, we are not in the right place when it comes to achieving these targets. And this means that more action is needed, especially within the member states. And this is because when you look at the pledges, you combine the pledges plus the policy scenarios, still we are not meeting the target by 2030, unless from COP29 we see very significant, significant developments when it comes to addressing the mitigation itself. Very quick investments into the energy sector so that we curb or we stop using fossil fuels, or we slow down on using fossil fuels completely. Secondly, we really need to see a very strong political will, because that is one area that is usually lacking. People go to COP, political leaders go to COP, but then after COP, we start planning for another COP. So when do we take time to make actions or make pledges a reality, especially on the element of methane emissions, the element of investing in the renewables, and also the elements of taking key actions and supporting the right people to invest in the right technologies, and as well as the quick reallocation of capital from the private sector. That is what is actually needed. However, as it stands, we are not in a good standing when it comes to achieving the 1.5 scenario, either by 2030.
All right, what a way to wrap up this conversation. Brian Owino, we must thank you joining us all the way from Kenya this morning. Thank you so much for your time, for your submissions and your thoughts on this development. It's one Africa, and we hope with what we are doing, Africa will get better, and globally we'll all be in a better place by 2030 to assess the level of development. Thank you so much for creating time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning, and our regards to our brothers and sisters in Kenya.
Thank you for having me, Femi.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.